think we're going to make a start. This is being recorded, so hopefully you are all comfortable with that. Thank you and welcome everyone. It is a delight to see you all. I'd ask that you keep yourself on mute. We will have a Q&A segment later in the session, and at that point I'd love you to come off mute and use the hand functions. Hand up functions. But let me start in the spirit of reconciliation by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today from different parts of the country. Today, I'm on the land of the Cabral clan of the Darug Nation. I also acknowledge that this land was accessed by peoples of the Dharawal Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the culture and dreams of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I recognise and respect their cultural and continual relationship and connections to land, water, and culture. I also take this opportunity to recognise those with lived and living experience of mental health challenges, their carers, kin and allies. MHCC continues to remain informed by their insight and expertise in our work. And I also recognise those who remain silent and private about their mental health challenges. Welcome to our inaugural member briefing. This one will be on the HASI CLS review, procurement and timeline. We are keen to hear feedback at the end of the session to see whether or not this hits the mark and whether or not you'd like future member briefings. We've limited today's session to only member representatives of MHCC and CEOs so that the speakers and attendees are familiar with the audience. Some are current HASI CLS providers and others are not, but in acknowledgement that this will move to an open tender next year, it is important that we have the potential MHCC member registered providers. For those unfamiliar with the HASI CLS program, HASI stands for the Housing Supported Initiative, sorry, let me get that right, Housing and Assistance Support Initiative, and CLS stands for Community Living Support. HASI CLS programs are funded by New South Wales Health and are designed to support individuals with severe mental health challenges, facilitating the transition of care from hospital settings to community-based services. A 2022 HASI CLS evaluation report indicated that these programs have significantly improved wellbeing, mental health management, physical health and social inclusions for participants. Consumer contact with public health outpatient services decreased by 10% in the first year and was 64% less if they remained in the programs for more than 1 year. Hospital admissions due to mental health decrease reduced by a total of 74%, and the average length of stay in hospital decreased by circa 75% over 2 years. The net cost saving per person was about $86,000 over 5 years. Over 90% of those cost offsets were from reduced hospital admissions and lower lengths of stay. We are obviously very keen to see the HASI CLS program extend and expand, and that's something that informs a lot of our advocacy campaigning, whether it's in the pre-budget submission or in the New South Wales Mental Health Inquiry. It's something that we continue to advocate for as your peak. With the current HASI CLS contract set to expire in 2026, New South Wales Health is reviewing the service models to ensure they continue to meet the needs of individuals with severe mental health challenges and incorporate recommendations from the 2022 evaluation report. I'm delighted to be joined by our guest speakers today, Amy Wyndham, Karen Demar, and Dr. Leanne Ruggiero. If you have a question during the presentations, can you send it through the chat, and I will open it up to Q&A after all guests have spoken and presented, and you can unmute yourself and ask the question at the time. In the meantime, please ensure that you're on mute when the guests speak. And to begin with, I'm delighted to introduce Amy Wyndham, who's the Director for Community Programs and Partnerships with the Mental Health Branch in New South Wales Health to provide some opening remarks. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Thanks, Evelini, and hello to everyone joining today. As Evelini said, my name's Amy Wyndham and I'm the Director of the Community Programs and Partnerships here in the Mental Health Branch. And the world of HASI, CLS, HASI Plus and CLSR for refugees all falls within the remit of one of my teams that Karen heads up. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I am currently on the beautiful lands of the Gamaragal people, and I thank them for their care and custodianship of this land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I too extend my respect to all people with lived experience of mental health conditions, their family, kin and carers. It's certainly something that we keep at the heart of everything that we do in the mental health branch. And while there's always room to do more and to improve the way that we do that, I do think that we are making genuine headways in terms of ensuring that our consumers, carers, family and kin are at the heart of everything that we do. I'm just going to be super brief because Karen's got a beautiful presentation that she'll run you through that really covers off the key issues that we want to touch on today. But I did just want to sort of say a couple of things. Firstly, like many of you, I have lived experience of the previous HASI CLS tender processes. So I recognise the potential triggering that some of this might have for people, and please reach out to your colleagues should you need any support during this difficult time. But we really, really hope that the work that the team is putting into it, and in terms of doing the consultation that we'll walk you through, that we take people on the full journey that we're going on from beginning to end, so that people will have a greater level of understanding of the complexity of not only the review, but then tackling the actual tendering part of it as well. As I'm sure you'd all appreciate, these are, it's very complex. We're dealing with a very complex sector, the changes, the NDIS, all of the sort of things that everyone on this call is aware of. So we really want to try and make this as smooth as possible. But I will say that today's conversation is definitely geared more towards the service model review part of the exercise, because that's what we're in at the moment. Obviously, everything that we hear goes towards informing some of the tender process itself. But I suspect a lot of the questions people might have are around the actual tender process. We're just not there yet because while we've done some preliminary work in terms of unpacking what the last tender looked like and what the learnings were from that tender, and for those who were a part of the process, we actually got Procure Group to do a bit of an analysis of that previous tender work for us. They spoke to a few people about their experiences and highlighted some of the areas that we really need to do better on this time around. And a lot of those are around the communications. So we need to obviously get better than that. And that's when we're really hoping to tap into MHCC's network like we're doing today to make sure that we keep people up to date with how we're going. But today's focus is primarily on the HASI CLS service review part of the work that we're doing. And I've just got to say from the outset, if I could achieve one thing from this review, it would be to lose the HASI name. It's the Housing and Accommodation Support Initiative, which is great to say HASI, super easy, super quick, and there is a lot of history behind the name, and a lot of people will be sad to lose a name that that's been associated with this program for so long. But I think the feedback that we get, and certainly some of the confusion that we often hear when others speak about this program, is the fact that it sounds as though accommodation is actually a part of it. For those who can think back to its original, the original way it was designed, we did have greater connection through to DCJ and housing, and there was a greater connection to that. It's now moved on where that is much more about, it's determined by need. I mean, obviously they're considered a priority group, and obviously part of the HASI CLS program is working with people to either obtain suitable housing or retain it. but the name HASI does seem to give the indication that it actually does come with housing, which can be misleading. So we're quite keen, like if that's the one outcome that I would get to out of this, I'll be happy. But obviously we really want to try and contemporise the model, make sure it's fit for purpose. What were some of the learnings that came out of the COVID years that we can take forward, but also what are some of the things that have crept in that aren't quite in keeping with the goals of the program that we might need to reconsider. And I guess the only other thing I'd say before handing over to Karen is obviously we are talking to, I think, as wide a range of stakeholders as we possibly can. And again, I'm sure you'd appreciate that everyone has their own views on what HASI and CLS could or should be. My only note to make there is that obviously we only have finite resources. And as Evelini said, we are also constantly trying to push the message that if we had more of this, it would have better outcomes in terms of people needing our pointier end, more expensive, trying to appeal to our Treasury colleagues' sensibilities. So Karen will touch on some of those findings that certainly indicate that. So have no fear. The Ministry, from our perspective, we are very keen to see this program grow. We were delighted to see it as a recommendation from the recent inquiry. However, it unfortunately doesn't sit with us to make those sorts of decisions in terms of the funding. So I think with any service model review, it's about being innovative, looking at opportunities, letting go of things that haven't been as successful, but also managing expectations. And that's something that's really key to how we sort of go about this comms piece, the communications piece as well, in terms of just ensuring everybody's on the journey with us, understanding what we can and can't do, but hopefully recognising that these are excellent programs that have wonderful outcomes, and we want to keep them going, if not make them even better. So that's probably it just for me from a bit of an intro, but otherwise I'll hand over to Karen to pick things up and go forth.
Thanks, Amy, for that. Thank you. Okay. Nim's going to share the slides for me. Thank you, Nim. Great. So I'm talking about, I guess, the HASI CLS review and really putting it in the context of the history of the program and what we're delivering at the moment. Thanks, Nim. So I should say before I start, I'm Karen Demar, Principal Policy Officer of the Community Living Programs in the Mental Health Branch in the Ministry. I sit across the suite of New South Wales mental health community living programs for adults, which include HASI, CLS, HASI Plus, and our Community Living Supports Refugees program, which are all across the state, as well as the housing homelessness portfolio for the Ministry. Alyssa, Raphael and Adam Vines join me as well today for the program, who lead on our HASI CLS program. So to begin, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate their connection to land, waters and how culture is held, nurtured and shared. And I'm joining today from the land of the Dark and Junk on the Central Coast. We pay our respects. I'd also like to acknowledge those living or with the lived experience of mental health illness, as well as their families and carers in the meeting today. Thanks, Nin. So the history of HASI, it's evolved over 2 decades. It's 22 years old this year. So it began as a partnership between our local health districts, our CMOs and Department of Communities and Justice, offering 100 high support packages of up to 5 hours a day with stable housing, clinical and accommodation support. So as Amy mentioned, at the time accommodation was provided by DCJ, or FACS as it was then. So in 2005 to 7, HASI introduced another 736 support packages ranging from very high, up to 8 hours a day, to low support, up to 5 hours per week. Over time, accommodation stopped being provided as part of the program due to housing availability, and that remains to this day. There is no housing provided. In 2007, HASI in the home was introduced for people with secure accommodation, such as their own rental property, their own home, or living with their family and carers or other people in the community. Unlike earlier stages of HASI, people did not have to be eligible or living in social housing to participate. In 2009, a culturally appropriate version of the HASI program began for Aboriginal people, and that offered 100 specific support packages for Aboriginal HASI. Thanks, Nin. In 2012, HASI Plus was introduced, which is a high-intensity transitional program for people with severe mental illness and significant functional impairment who require housing and support with 16 to 24 hours of support every day, and it offered 60 places. 2016, Community Living Supports was introduced, and this offered a flexible model of support building on the HASI principles of service delivery, and that was for 535 people. In 2017, HASI was retendered and merged into one program, so the Aboriginal HASI and HASI mainstream were merged, and at the time it adopted the Community Living Supports flexible support model. In 2019, we introduced the Community Living Supports Refugee Program, which offers culturally appropriate support to at least 79 refugees and asylum seekers at any point in time. That's currently delivering at least double. So it's a hugely popular program. In 2020, we extended HASI Plus in Kempsey on the mid-north coast to offer an additional 10 places, bringing that to 70. So basically, as Evelini said earlier, it's HASI CLS are statewide programs that help people with a severe mental illness to live independently and participate in the community in the way they want to. It is currently delivered by 8 CMOs in partnership with our LHDs across New South Wales. And the map basically shows where that is located by provider. This hasn't been updated. More than 83.3 million is invested in the program annually. So it's a huge investment from New South Wales Health. And together, HASI CLS support over 1,799 people with a severe mental illness to come in across New South Wales to live and participate in the community. It's our daily number of consumers is higher than that, but that's the minimum benchmark. And as I said earlier, it's been operating successfully for 22 years. Thanks, Nin. So what supports does HASI and CLS offer? They provide recovery-oriented, flexible and individualised psychosocial supports that help people build independence in daily life and contribute to recovery. The types of support depend on the person's needs and their individual support plan, which articulates their goals. This is reviewed every 3 months with the person. So daily living skills such as self-care, shopping, finances, cooking, catching public transport, referral to and support to access mental and physical health services, participating in social, leisure or sporting activities, building relationships across the community, learning new skills, accessing education or support to get employment, finding and keeping housing, so maintaining tenancies is a huge part of the program, moving back into the community from a hospital or, say, corrective services, or accessing other supports like alcohol and other drug services, and increasingly the NDIS. We also don't have an upper age limit on HASI and CLS, so we're finding more that older people access the program and they can access, say, a My Age Care package whilst they're getting HASI CLS support. So between July 23 and June this year, at the time 80.6 million was invested last year in the programs before indexation. 4,305 consumers were supported in that 12 months. 48% were male, 52% female. The average time in the program is 18 months, so it is a transitional program with people being supported to reach the recovery goals and then be linked to mainstream services in the community to support them going forward. Nearly 1.5 million hours of support was provided, which is remarkable across the state. 31% of the consumers had a primary diagnosis of schizophrenia, 19% had legal orders in place. Coexisting conditions, 21% were in public or social housing, 44% of consumers smoke, and that's a targeted area to try and reduce that. And harmful or dependent alcohol or other drug use was reported through self-report as 20%. 43% had family care involvement. 17% identified statewide as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and that varies in districts. There's up to 40% of consumers, say in Western New South Wales, identify as Aboriginal. 11% multicultural consumers, and 15% had an NDIS plan in place. Thanks, Nim. So, as Evelini touched on before, the learnings from our 2022 evaluation, that was a 3-year longitudinal evaluation. Hospital admissions for mental health reduced by 74%. Length of stay in hospital reduced by almost 75%, which is remarkable. And contact with community mental health services reduced by 63.7%. Near zero new criminal charges or community correction orders, and 86,000 per person net cost saving over 5 years. And there was a 0.25% increase quality adjusted life years per person. So strengths of HASI and CLS were and remain our strong local partnerships between our CMO providers and our LHDs, person-centred responsive approach to service provision, and the flexible hours of support funding that we now provide instead of packages really rings very true then. That's been highly successful. Focus on early intervention when consumers are becoming unwell, and an increasing focus from CMOs on consumer choice. So the service model review, as we mentioned earlier, the review is really to look at how we can improve and enhance the HASI CLS model, acknowledging it's great as it is, but how can we make it more contemporary and align it with current changes across the sector, such as the emergence of NDIS, and really looking at how, before we go out to tender, the model of support. There is no additional funding that we know of, there's no magic wand, but we also will be doing a financial review of current services just to look at how we will sort of, I guess, arrange the supports to be offered across the state within the existing funding envelope. So that's very important. So in June 24, we conducted a synthesis of the HASI CLS program documents, which Leanne will talk to from ACI, and there was also a desktop review and synthesis of the research evidence. Also, an online consultation was opened by the Agency for Clinical Innovation to consult with key stakeholders to understand their current experiences of delivering HASI CLS services and insights to refresh the model. Where we are now, it does say August, but we've slipped into September, community consultations have occurred to inform the model of care, and there's been consultations with current consumers, carers, and also with Aboriginal consumers of the program that the Agency for Clinical Innovation have hosted. They were done in August. And also key stakeholder consultations to inform the model of care. They will now be happening over the next couple of weeks, and they will include our current CMOs, our local health districts, peak bodies, Aboriginal organisations as well, to really understand what's working well in the program and areas to enhance or improve on or add. Pricing workshops will happen later in September. By the end of October, we will have key principles of the consultation shared with our HASI CLS review working group to start informing the request for tender. In December, end of the year, we'll be defining pricing and market stewardship principles to go ahead with the tender, and then also consolidating and synthesising all model evidence inputs to rewrite the service model document. And then we're hoping to finalise that in January, February next year. And we are under incredibly tight timeframes because the tender, is coming up. We need to really begin that process probably mid next year, ahead of the end of the contracts in June 26. Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion points anyone wants to raise?
So feel free to put your hand up or add the questions in chat. Otherwise, keep the questions in mind while we get to the next speaker and then have the panel. But you're more than welcome to ask if you want to If you can't, just because Zoom has changed, the heart is where you find your raise hand, or because the questions are not overwhelming at the moment. Bill, it's the first time I've called you William. That's
Yes, it
you're in
is.
trouble.
Sound,
But that was the
sound
first
like my
name
mother.
that came up. Bill, please.
That's right.
yeah.
Thanks, Evelini. My question is relating to housing or accommodation, because I know
Yeah.
HASI is moving away
Sorry,
from
Bill,
that.
I'm going to be difficult. As you're
Yep.
asking your question, if you can indicate your name and your
Oh,
organisation, that'll help
Apologies.
all that's on the line.
yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, so it's Bill Campbell here, I'm the CEO of ICLA, which is Independent Community Living Australia. So we offer quite a lot of services around complex mental health. We don't offer HASI, but we do have a number of services similar to HASI. My question relates to the accommodation or the housing piece. Obviously, the HASI is moving away from the actual housing or accommodation delivery or availability. But for providers such as us who do have, or we are a community housing provider, and we do have, I suppose, accommodation options, does that also align with the HASI, I suppose, grant or tender process?
Well, we actually started moving away from housing from 2007. So there's been no accommodation provided since that time. So people will either come to the HASI program with accommodation, or the LHD and the CMO and other people in that person's life will help them find accommodation. Currently, we have people living in all sorts of accommodation for the program, whether it's private rental, social housing or community housing, or whether they're living with family and carers. Some people may not have a roof over their head at this stage, so they're supported to access housing, or they might be in a boarding house. So it's very broad. Yeah. But there is no funding within the program to fund any. Yeah, if that's your question, there's no funding for that. It's just the support to the person.
Thanks,
But
Bill.
I was just going to ask quickly, so if we have people who are currently in our accommodation services, but they do not have HASI, can they apply for HASI?
Yes, yes. I don't see an issue with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Karen. Corin? You're on mute, Corin.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Karen, for your presentation. I did put my comment in the chat, but I'll say it. You talked about the program being transitional, and when you say you link to mainstream services, can you describe a bit more about what those are? Is it GPs or?
Yes,
Thanks.
GPs or private psychiatrists in the community. So people they don't stay with the community mental health team service support forever, but they will have that as a backup whilst they're in the HASI CLS program. But transitioning people to access more mainstream services, such as accessing GP or private psychiatrists and linking into other, say, social or community support groups in the community. There's a whole range of things, just so that they can continue living on their own with some support. We're finding increasingly consumers are also accessing the NDIS, which provides support going forward as well.
So, do you have any stats on that longitudinal outcome, so that you're following people after they leave HASI, so that we've got an indication in the long term?
It's a good question. Our MDS data doesn't capture any information on people once they exit the program.
Sounds like it's a good study to have a look at, maybe somewhere down the track. See, you know, how consistent, you know, the recovery is, you know, how it's maintained over a period. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Corin. Thanks, Karen. Any other questions? We do have a few minutes before our next speaker is due to speak. Okay, well, if you do think of anything else, then feel free to ask it when we have the panel down the track. But our next speaker is Dr. Leanne Ruggiero, who is has got a PhD in cognitive science and is the evidence synthesis officer for Critical Intelligence Unit at the Clinical Innovation and Research Department for New South Wales Health. So welcome, Leanne, and I'll hand over to you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Evelini. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. So my name is Leanne. I work in a team at New South Wales Health called the Critical Intelligence Unit, which used to be one person a couple of years ago. And then during COVID, we suddenly found our team was in demand. The government wanted lots of information on what is everyone around the world doing about COVID and where's the best research? So our team's grown since then, and we now have a kind of capacity where we support the Agency for Clinical Innovation and Ministry of Health in the projects that they're developing and redesigning to make sure that when we're running programs around New South Wales Health, that they are underpinned by the best available research, and that they're also informed by what other jurisdictions around the world with similar programs are doing. So I spend a lot of my time reading and writing about a range of different projects. So at the Agency for Clinical Innovation, of course, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we work on. I'm working from home today on Camaragal land, where I love being close to the water. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal peoples here today. We also recognise and appreciate consumers, patients, carers, supporters and their loved ones. We know that the voices of people with lived experiences are very powerful, as you'll all know, and their contributions are absolutely vital to enabling decision-making for health system change. So I'm going to give you a bit of a summary of the work that's happened in the background to start informing the new HASI service model that will be coming out. So my team conducted a literature review looking at what's the most recent research on best practices in psychosocial support. So as part of conducting that review, that means that the service model that comes out will be underpinned by the latest best practice and it will be evidence-based. In that review, I included information from other states in Australia or other jurisdictions with similar healthcare or mental health services to Australia. So I was looking at policy documents from places like New Zealand, Canada, the UK, in cases where their services were comparable to what we're doing here with HASI. And it also included research papers in peer-reviewed journals. So altogether, there were 51 documents that I included and reviewed and that I synthesized together. So I just present a couple of the key findings for you today. Firstly, some of the main things I learned about how service models are working in other jurisdictions internationally. And it was no surprise that the service models differ very widely from one jurisdiction to another. Even the services in Queensland or Canberra, for example, have a lot of overlapping principles, but run very differently to how we do here in New South Wales. So there was wide variation. But they did have a lot of things in common. So I've grouped those together here. All programs tended to adopt a personalised, recovery-based approach and a culture of hope. And a lot of the documents that I read emphasise that this culture of hope needed to extend throughout the entire program. So right from the top in the way that the governance worked, right down to the bottom in the way that the support workers conduct themselves. They all tended to have a focus on facilitating everyday activities and social inclusion for the consumers. And they tended to measure their effectiveness in a range of ways, including asking consumers about their experiences, looking at their mental health outcomes over time, their healthcare resource use, so how often are consumers ending up in hospital, and looking at how well and how often they're attaining the goals that they've set for themselves. So that tended to align a lot with things that we're already doing in New South Wales, which was great, but it's also good to see what other jurisdictions are doing. I found one piece that had been written by Health Services Ireland very interesting, and so I've just chosen to have a slide here to highlight that because I think it gives us something to think about when we move forward with our programs. And they talked about how the quality of running your psychosocial support service, it can be conceptualized or measured in 3 different ways. So they said we can measure the effectiveness of the treatment and the care that's provided to consumers. And of course, effectiveness of treatment is going to be things like, are consumers achieving their goals? How are their mental health outcomes over time? the safety of treatment and care provided to consumers. So, of course, that would involve measuring things like incident reporting in terms of safety, and measuring consumer comfort in the program. And the third one was the broader experience that consumers and their carers and families have of the treatment and care they receive. So this is less about numbers that you can capture and more about making sure that evaluations are taking place where you ask the consumers about their experiences in the program. So if I now take you to look at what the research evidence said, so these are formal studies, so they've tried to change some of the variables and study what effect those would have on how well the psychosocial support program runs. There was a number of facilitators of best practice that they found. So here's some of the ones that they talked about in terms of organisation and culture. They talked about how important it was to have good communication and networking between organisations and having formal and informal channels for that. Having co-designed services where the consumers and their loved ones have been asked about how they think the service could run better. I've said this earlier, but the entire program has a culture of hope and recovery, and it has a strengths-based approach to keep people positive and motivated and working on their goals. The consumers need to have a sense of feeling known, believed, and supported. A lot of the research emphasised how important it was to have continuity of care in the support workers that were going in, that developed a rapport with certain consumers over time, but also in the funding to make sure that and they talked about avoiding re-traumatization, and what it means there is that if a consumer is having to work with different support workers all the time or dropping in and out of short-term services, having to explain their backstory over and over again can be re-traumatizing. So that continuity of care allows them to establish a longer working relationship with someone where they can feel a bit more stable and not having to be explaining their history again and again. There were a couple of more facilitators of best practice that had to do with goals and activities. So the research talked about how important it was to consider family and peer relationships when we're developing goals with consumers. It talked about the importance of having a range of different activities available, not just the same ones all the time. They need to be personally relevant and age appropriate. So, you know, the activities that the 20-something-year-olds are doing are not necessarily going to be the same ones that the people who are older are going to engage with. So the importance of having a large range. The activities need to have a focus on psychosocial goals and social exchanges and interactions, and also the opportunity to incorporate physical activity. So things like walking groups or yoga and things like that can help with that. And of course, in able to do all of these other things I've already said, the support workers need to have appropriate training and also supervision so that they have someone to debrief with, to problem solve, come up with new activities, or to check in with if they've had a difficult day. So a lot of the research really emphasised how important that training and supervision was, or all of the other points I've mentioned wouldn't work as well. So that was the main findings. In addition to all the things I've already said, there were a couple of research papers that specifically looked at psychosocial support programs in Aboriginal populations, which was great because sometimes when we go looking for research in Aboriginal populations, we just don't find much, but there were a couple of papers on this. So additional facilitators of best practice for those populations included establishing connections within the broader community, families, and the Aboriginal communities that consumers belong to or live in. So it was an emphasis on connection. The services need to be built on the values of respectfulness, trust, and non-judgmentalism toward consumers, especially when the support workers are coming from a different cultural background. The mainstream services need a good understanding of Aboriginal conceptualizations of health and well-being, including that concept that the connection to land and family is really important. and appropriate professional development to ensure staff have the necessary skills and cultural competence. So again, none of the top 3 dot points can happen unless we make sure that the staff have had the appropriate training and know how to support those things. So those are the main things that came out of my review of all of the evidence. And what happens is that now the knowledge that we've gained from that will move forward to inform the new service model that's coming out. I'm very happy to answer questions in the Q&A section.
Thank you so much, Leanne. So it's pretty much open to questions now, whether it's for Leanne or Karen or Amy. I've got a few that have come directly to me, which is why I posted the question. Sometimes people get nervous as you're leading into a procurement process to ask the question directly, and that's why they're quite comfortable to come through me. But I'll just open it up first to the whole group if there's any questions that anyone does want to ask. All right, I might go to the questions in the chat then. So one's an easy one. Karen and Leanne, are you happy for your slides to be shared from today's presentation?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay,
That's
so
fine.
I've got yours, Karen. Leanne, if you don't mind sending it through, we'll include it in the communique that we'll send post this event. That would be
Yeah.
great.
No problem.
One question that's come through is, and this might be a good one for you, Amy, to answer, is we've done the 2022 review and that was quite significant. What's different about this review?
Thanks, Evelini. So the evaluation was released in 2022. So that was an evaluation of the actual program delivery and what the outcomes were. This is a review going back and saying, what actually is the program? Who is it aimed at? Have we still got the right age range? Have we still got the right psychosocial supports? One of the things that I'm keen on interrogating is with our Aboriginal consumers, families and carers, is what might look different for psychosocial supports for that group, for example. So this is more about a review of the actual program itself, and I'm just using the singular program because they're both the same in my books. So it's kind of just stripping it back a bit and sort of saying, okay, it's been in place for a very long time with very few changes beyond what the changes were in 2016-17 about moving away from packages to flexible hours, which, as Karen said, has worked really, really well. And also just, who's the target group? What's the eligibility? So this is more of a review of the actual program rather than an evaluation of what the program had achieved up until 2022. So they are quite different. Having said that, obviously this review absolutely takes into account all of the findings from that evaluation and previous evaluations. As we know, this is probably one of the most well-evaluated programs going around because we constantly want to demonstrate its how successful it can be for people. Although, Corinne, I take your point about the longitudinal study and perhaps something we can keep in mind should funding become available. But yeah, any information that we've received in the programs and including information as those who have been involved in the program delivery, that evaluation, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, I think covered just up until the end of or halfway through COVID or something.
Yes,
yes. So when we do the next one, because there'll always be a next one, one of the things that we'll need to take into account is what impact COVID had on the program and how we've come out of that. So part of the conversations that either ACI or H4 will be having with various stakeholders is building on what's happened since that evaluation finished. So hopefully it's a real gathering information from every place we possibly can.
Yes. And so just adding to what Amy said, exactly everything she said, but also the evaluation had some, I guess, areas for improvement or recommendation. So the review really wants to also unpack those and look at, do we want to include those in the model going forward? Yeah. And how we can include those. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Gary?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Leanne mentioned measuring the quality of support. I'm just wondering if the ministry has thought about changing the MDS, because Amy was talking about the trauma of the last retendering. I mean, the MDS has also caused a bit of trauma, and just, whether we're collecting the right data, if we are, and if not, are we looking at changing it?
Good question, Gary. And I know it's something that has come up quite a bit. As you know, there's, I don't know how many, over 200 pages of our data dictionary with all the details, and it's still probably not detailed enough of what we collect. I know the living in the community questionnaire comes up a lot as, is that the right measure? So that's another piece of work we would need to look at. But the MDS is certainly something, but not during this review. I think that would have to be something extra. And there's quite a big, I guess, piece of work on that, and there is a financial cost to the ministry to change that. But thank you, we take that on board. Yeah.
And thanks, Karen and Gary. Yeah, it is a really interesting one, because I know the ministry as a whole is really trying to move away from collecting data for data collection's sake, and really getting to the nitty-gritty of what is it that we actually want to know, what's the important stuff, and what can we just park. And a lot of that can come down to often the fact that this program has been around for such a long time. It's clearly demonstrated its worth. So now what is the next thing we want to look to? And that's some of those quality improvement type of things. So I would say that, yes, it will change. But as Karen said, it's probably something that we'd need to consider as a separate sort of project, because it'd be quite a bit of work to tackle that, to narrow it down, because again, we need to balance the kind of data that we need to do an evaluation to demonstrate the value to our friends in Treasury. So, there will certainly be a decent data collection, but hopefully we can get it down to a place that's much more manageable for all concerned, because I know it's quite a weighty one. And even like future evaluations, I can see them just being a bit more targeted. We've done these very, very large valuations, which has been fabulous, because the evidence has been wonderful to be able to take to present to cabinet, etc. But whether that's still necessary, and whether we can do a different kind of evaluation, and again, maybe Corin's sort of longitudinal thing might come in to play there, although that is harder to track people over
once they've left
time. But
thanks, Amy. So we've got quite a few questions now. Some are public and some have come through Anon. So 2 Anons and 1 from Kathy Borman. The first question is, will the new model integrate a human rights approach? Who's best directed to answer that one?
Look, I don't know if it's sort of been explicitly addressed in the papers that we've provided to either ACI or H4. However, I think under the guidance of not only so I should say that we have this steering committee that's set up, and there are a number of key partners in that steering committee who would most definitely be bringing the human rights perspective to any documentation that we produce, and that includes obviously Avellini, but our peak organisations of being and mental health carers New South Wales, amongst others. So it's something that we'll draw to the attention of H4, ACI and the steering committee a little bit more closer, because I think it is something we need to consider, but I don't think it's been explicitly mentioned as yet. Karen, you'd agree I'm not missing a piece that I haven't forgotten about?
No, I think we haven't explicitly stated that. Yeah.
But noted, yeah.
Thanks. Good feedback, Ms. Anon. The other question, actually, Nim, if you could help me out by just bringing up that timeline that Karen presented. A question for clarification is, so I think, Karen, you said February to refine some of that finalised data. So you thinking the second half of next year to actually go out to open tender? Sorry, I've lost you on screen, Karen. There we go.
Sorry. Alyssa, do you want to talk to that? Well, sorry.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us and thank you for sharing your time with us. So in regards to the open tender next year, we're absolutely aiming to have a second half of the year tender. We haven't confirmed exactly when it will be, but this is all dependent on ministerial approvals, and there's a really huge review process that also goes in the back end of that. So we do also want to make sure that we accommodate for ample time for providers to have debriefing sessions as well as award contracts and have an appropriate transitional period. So the aim at this point is definitely the second half of 2025.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alyssa.
Yes.
And so, Kathy, do you want to ask your question so that it's not always me talking, given you've made it a public question?
Yeah, well, if you want to have a look in the chat, it's there. But obviously, all of us in the sector were interested in to read the unmet needs. And I know, Amy, you've had quite, and the branch has had quite a significant input into this. But I guess our question was, what was in the report and what was reported for New South Wales, how will that influence the design and focus of HASI CLS for this upcoming tender, and what would that look like? Or have you not thought through that yet?
Not in any detail, Kathy, but I think one of the things that was really interesting coming out of that process was exactly that our programs really do provide the sort of support that we would expect those on with more severe mental health conditions to be requiring, so that they can actually recover well in the community in the way they want to. So it was really interesting for us to be a part of it, to actually see that on paper, to see the comparison between the states and our program, noting that, you know, we were able to hold on to our HASI CLS programs when the NDIS came into play. I think that has obviously, hopefully most people would agree that that has been incredibly beneficial to people needing these supports in New South Wales. When you get down to if you think of the sort of basics of it, where New South Wales services are really meant to be for the pointier end versus what the Commonwealth is funding. I can't see that that our programs would be changing that much. Our programs are still aimed at people with that high level of need. So we're not going to be diluting the program, or and I mean, obviously, depending on what we get from the stakeholder consultations, but it's really aimed at who New South Wales Health services are aimed at, and that is that more complex, more enduring end. A different conversation is around the foundational supports work that the NDIS is leading, and if anybody at this table can explain that to me, I would be eternally grateful. So to sort of just put it out there that we're all in the same sort of boat in that regards. Not quite sure what's going on in that space. But I think our focus will still be on that smaller number of people, the type of support that the people who traditionally might come into our inpatient services and exit, which has always been the primary target group, I suppose. Karen?
No, I agree. And I was thinking of the foundational supports as well, because as we know, the HPA analysis report will definitely inform that foundational piece and how they design the foundational supports. Will that be a lighter touch HASI or will it be something else? We don't know. We don't know. And that doesn't sit with us, but it will be very interesting just to see. But I agree with Amy. We do that severe pointy end. Like last year, there was 4,300 people supported through HASI CLS, and the hospital reductions and presentations to community mental health dropped dramatically. And that does enable other people with a very severe mental illness to then receive support through health, which otherwise probably would be blocking that channel. So
we've got a couple of other states who are actually quite interested in our model because they want to make sure that they secure that kind of support for their higher needs consumers.
Especially since the NDIS hasn't probably delivered what they thought it would deliver, and that could change. So I think it's 4 other jurisdictions have contacted us to have in-depth discussions on developing their own HASI CLS type models.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Amy. Are there any other questions from the group? Or Amy, is there anything that you need from the group, knowing that the consultations, I think there's one on Thursday. Is there anything you'd like to share or anything else? I'm gathering there's no more questions coming in through the chat, so we might wind it up fairly quickly.
Just to encourage people, if you are involved in those two, very happy to hear everyone's ideas. If you're not directly involved in that, we are very happy to capture everybody's thoughts and feedback, and we're doing that in a variety of ways, including we're going to be doing a bit of a sort of a survey to capture some of those people that might not be our first cab off the rank in terms of stakeholders, and some of those might be some of the Homes New South Wales staff out in the sectors, just to get a sense of what they're seeing from their perspective. So just to encourage you to engage with the process, and if you've got any ideas, if you've seen it something work, but we're just trying to see what else we can create within the funding envelope. But are there ways of doing it that we still engage the consumer group that we want to, but in a way that's much more meaningful. Also really keen to hear from people who have experiences or case studies. I'm a big fan of case studies for selling a program around specific vulnerable groups. I've already mentioned our Aboriginal consumers and specific piece that ACI are doing with us in consulting with our Aboriginal HASI CLS consumers, families and carers around that. But also other groups, multicultural groups, LGBTQIA+, consumers, and a range of others. So if you do have sort of specific information or thoughts on those groups, we'd be very keen to hear that too. We obviously stepped away from when we used to have HASI Aboriginal as a specific standalone, and again, that's worked incredibly well in terms of and setting benchmarks versus having something separate, in terms of having that flexibility for providers to respond to the needs of Aboriginal consumers in their areas. But again, one of the things I'm keen for us to explore is the relationship between providers and their local art shows, or AMS as the case may be, to make sure that we're actually really understanding what local needs and local contexts are around those providers.
Thanks, Amy. 2 more questions have come in. One is, bearing in mind that HASI users are generally people with complex needs, do you envisage supported decision-making being available to ensure co-design is meaningful?
Karen, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say that's a really good discussion point, Evelyn, and it is something I think we need to look at more going forward with the
I
providers.
think probably something to raise at the review committee, but
Yeah.
probably need to declare a conflict of interest, and that is that MHCC is rolling out supported decision-making training. The other question that's come in is, do you see health programs as a priority for HASI in the new model, not just in terms of tackling tobacco?
Yes, definitely. And it is something we do ask in our annual report for our providers to comment on, and it's certainly a focus area. And we are finding providers definitely encouraging and offering more activities for people, but it is something, yep, we will be writing in.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for all physical health issues. And we're particularly keen to explore also, say no wrong door, but when we're talking about AOD issues, just making sure that because we know they often go hand in hand, that we are creating those environments where providers, whether they be funded, it's almost like how can we work towards putting the funding body aside so that our mental health providers and AOD providers, with the assistance of MHCC and NADA, for example, work together to make that separate, those two sectors be able to do those sort of warm transfers a bit to the best of their abilities. So just connecting more of the dots for people, making those, not having to tell those stories a million times, as we heard from Leanne, etc.
Thanks, Amy. Last call for questions before this this meeting closes. Any other questions? I can't see any more questions in chat, either directly or to the whole group. So there's a couple of things to share with you from here. We will obviously be sending a communique later post this meeting, and it'll be included in FYI. That'll include the communique that New South Wales Health has already shared with us. It'll include the slides from today, and it'll include a recording from today. There will also be a bit of a feedback request at the end of this meeting. This is our first member briefing. If it's useful, if it's something we want to continue, then I need to hear some feedback about what it is that you want to hear more from. I know foundational supports is probably one that I've already captured. They're 4 quick questions, so please do stay on so that you can complete it. And on that basis, can you please join me in thanking Amy and Karen and Leanne for being our guest speakers today? And thank you, everyone, for joining in today's session. Hopefully it was useful. And I think that draws this meeting to a close. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Yeah,
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
Evelyn.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.